arrived in the Luther town Wittenberg. That's the official name of this town since 1938. Lutherstadt Wittenberg. You wouldn't find the name of the town in the itineraries under W, but under L. It's important to know about it. My name is Christina. Usually I start my tour with a citation by a famous painter who spent almost his whole life here in this town. This was Lucas Cranach. He wrote on a woodcut about Wittenberg in the beginning of 16th century. Wittenberg, the glorious town of God, residence and fortress of the real, the whole globe encompassing doctrine, capital of the electorate of Saxony, the famous among the universities of Europe, and by far the holiest place during the last 1,000 years. That's Wittenberg. I hope you are impressed. And during our tour we will find out what happens that Wittenberg got such a famous reputation. So please let us get started. First we go to the Luther house, and then it's all on one line, only 1,200 meters. And there we will see all the famous sites of Wittenberg. So please follow me. Right? And probably this fortification inspired Martin Luther to his famous chorale, "A mighty fortress is our God." The Marseillaise of the Reformation, as they call it also. And in the end of 19th century, they put down the town fortification and made a green belt around it. And town could spread out now. In this area, there is the industrial area. And here these are other settlement centers. Now we go into the courtyard. Because around him were wrong. And so it took quite a long time till he was ready to publish his famous 95 Theses against the abuse of indulgence letters to the portal of the castle church. Our Prince Elector, he was a very pious man. He collected relics. He laid out in his castle church to be worshipped by the believers, of course, after having paid for it. Up to the end of his life, this collection of relics comprised around 20,000 different objects. And they promised around 2 million years of liberation from purgatory. So it was worth to come to Wittenberg. It became an important pilgrimage center, and it was an economic effect. It brought money into the town. And that's the reason why Frederick the Wise had forbidden the other means with which you also could get to paradise. Those indulgence letters, you couldn't get them here in Saxony and in Wittenberg. But the frontier to the neighboring country was not far from here. And the Wittenbergers weren't stupid. They thought two things are better than one. And they went 40 kilometers towards the north to Jüterborg. And there they could buy from that famous Dominican monk, John Tetzel, mother of Jesus. You could worship after having paid for it. And on the other side of the frontier, you suddenly got indulgences for sins you haven't even committed. So it became sort of an investment paper. You're intending a murder, a robbery, an adultery. People felt sure with their papers in their pockets. And that was what Martin Luther was so worried about, that people continued their life without repenting their sins. So it finally on 31st of October 1517, that's what we celebrate throughout the whole year this year. He published his 95 Theses at the portal of the castle church. This was a tremendous attack to an important financial system of Catholic Church. They didn't want to accept, and there followed discussions, disputations. Finally, there was no result with Catholic Church. Several weeks later, he was excommunicated, and then he had to answer to the Emperor Charles V. He had just become emperor, and Martin Luther had to travel to the western side of Germany, to Worms, where took place the first big assembly of the emperor, the Diet of Worms. There they discussed things through. Martin Luther wasn't ready to recant, and finally he declared that he was responsible only to his own conscience, and that he accepted as authority alone the Holy Bible, neither Pope nor Emperor. This was a revolution. The Emperor had more language. Otherwise, the dialects would have developed totally differently from one end to the other. The Frisians couldn't understand the Bavarians anymore. which is, by the way, still rather difficult. In the meantime, riots broke out here in Wittenberg, and they were the reason why Martin Luther returned as his wife into this house in 1525. She had a lot of work to make this house livable again, to draw out the old rotten straw sacks, to work with several carts of lime. And then this house became the exemplary house of a Protestant pastor's family. This was another big revolution which took place then. So there their children had been born. In total they had 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls, 4 of them became grown up, and of the line of their daughter Margarete, we have today around 2,400 descendants. And Katharina, she turned out to be a real good organizer. The statue they gave her for her 500th birthday reveals very well her energy, her mentality. She was a real tough lady, we would say today. The frame indicates the transgression of medieval ages to modern times. Nothing less started here in Wittenberg. She became a good organizer. She had a farm, she had fishes, different gardens, was famous for brewing beer, what Martin Luther appreciated a lot. He called the oldest representation of Martin Luther in stone, made during his lifetime. And on the other side, his famous coat of arms, the Luther rose. So that's really special. Okay, Katharina, she should inherit this building after Martin Luther's death. But Saxon bureaucracy didn't accept the will of Martin Luther. He made a will for her, but it was against the jurisdiction of those times. Widows had no rights. They weren't able to do business affairs and, to be responsible for the education of the children. No, it wasn't that situation. Widows had almost no rights. So it was against the normal jurisdiction. And that's the reason why the Saxon bureaucracy didn't accept the will of Martin Luther. Katharina should go into a widow's hospice, only with the clothes she had on her, a spinning wheel, a chair. Daughter Margarete should have accompanied her. But then, and sons should have been given to scholars to be educated. But then war times broke out. The emperor threatened the town, and Katharina, as the widow of this famous reformer, had to flee with her children. When she returned a little bit later, there was a plague in Wittenberg. She had to flee once more towards the south. She had towards Torgau. She had to cross a huge forest area, and there was a horse accident. She fell from a cart. She let herself, had terrible injuries, from which she died 3 months later in Torgau. And so she's buried over there and not here in Wittenberg. And soon the children gave back this building to the university. Later on it was used as a poor school. From 19th century onwards it became a museum. Today it's the biggest museum for Reformation history. And also the explanation, a black cross on a natural colored heart in a white rose, a symbol for the Holy Spirit, surrounded by a blue field, a symbol for heaven, and then surrounded by a golden ring, a symbol for eternity. And he used this rose to authorize his writings. The question of copyright wasn't solved up to then in the beginning of the printing presses. And to declare, this writing came out of his own plume, there he put his rose onto it. So the Luther rose became one of the first copyright signs in the beginning of the printing presses. So, coming out, we keep to the left, please. Well, Melanchthon was born in southwest Germany as Philipp Black Earth, Schwarzerd in German. And already in the age of 12, he wrote his first Greek grammar. And to honor his academic capabilities, they translated his German name to Greek. This was a normal procedure in academical life, to Grecicize or Latinicize the names. Melas means black and Tornithers. In the age of 21, he got the second chair for Greek in Germany. The first one was in Tübingen. Well, When he arrived here in August 1518, so about 1 year after the proclamation of the 95 Theses, the Wittenbergers, because Martin Luther was put to ban all his life long, so he sent this tiny Philip Melanchthon abroad to represent the Wittenbergers there, especially in 1530 when he had to travel to Augsburg to represent to the Emperor Charles V that famous Augsburgian confession, hoping to prevent for a last time a rupture in the church. And when Wittenberg became finally Prussian territory, from beginning 19th century onwards, there were the wars against Napoleon. Napoleon was defeated because the Saxons had supported Napoleon. The Saxons had to give a big deal of their territory to Prussia. So from 1870 onwards, we don't have a university. The Prussian king didn't like those Orthodox Lutherans here. He had an inclination more towards the Calvin. Huh? And only the preaching seminary was preserved. The buildings of the university were used as a garrison. And after the wall came down, they tried to re-attract academical life. But we are here in the federal state of Sachsen-Anhalt. It's compounded by the former Prussian territory of Saxony. And keep in mind that you have to die. You see a clock, a baby, and a skull, and a Latin inscription which reads, Hodie mihi cras tibi. Today it's me, tomorrow it's you. We continue a little bit. Martin Luther's voice is still resounding in the walls of this church. Well, it became his preaching church. He preached here around 2,000 times, they say. Well, and the original pulpit is still to be preserved. It's to be found in the Luther House, in the museum. Well, why it's called Mother Church of Reformation. In this church, they celebrated for the first time Holy Supper in both kinds, bread and wine, also for the lay people. It took place on Christmas 1521, and it was not celebrated by Martin Luther because he was on the Wartburg Castle. It was celebrated by his doctor father, Andreas Bodenstein, also called Karlstadt, because he came from a town which name was Karlstadt. That was normal to call the peoples after their origins. Well? And that Andreas Bodenstein became the leader of those riots which broke out a little bit later, beginning March 1522. And those riots were the reason why Martin Luther returned to Wittenberg to calm down the Wittenbergers. A little bit later, in 1525, he was married to Katharina here in this church, Johannes Bugenhagen. He came from Pomerania, and so he was also called Dr. Pomeranus. Huh? And he undertook a lot of journeys towards the north of Germany and also a longer time to Denmark, introducing the new church order there. Well, hi. And so often he was traveling, and only then Martin Luther preached here in this church. He was always a professor of the university. And though he was asked by his students how to do a good sermon, and he answered in his sometimes rather rough way, well, put your foot on, open your mouth, and stop soon. The rules of a good rhetoric which are still valid today. Bugenhagen used to preach 1 hour, 2 hours. It took a long time till he was ready. And this caused a big confusion in the kitchen of the housewives, because it happens that people came home from Sunday service and roast wasn't already through. So housewives could only excuse themselves and think, oh, I thought Dr. Pomeranus preached today. Then the roast would have had much more time. Well, Bugenhagen is a very important figure in this whole context. He also should have got a statue on our market square, but as it happened so frequently, because of lack of money, he got only a bust on the northern side of this church. Well, he's buried here, but in the chancel part, but the tomb is not explicitly indicated. On the triumphal arch you find his grave. Ham Forage. They added this inscription just 10 years after Martin Luther's time. It's the title of one of his writings. Well, Shem Ham Forage is a Kabbalistical formula for the name of God Jewish people didn't pronounce. Instead of, they used this formula, Shem Ham Forage. Well, for him, Jewish people were like witches and sorcerers, enemies of Christianity. Well, so he left us a terrible legacy. In those writings, he asked to expel the Jews, to burn their writings, to put those who can work into camps, to destroy their synagogues. So he made a complete model for the future Nazi people. And that's a big tragedy. Well, he left us a real bad heritage in this regard. And only in the end of 20th century, Evangelical Church took an official distance of those writings of Martin Luther after the events of World War II. So, and the tragedy is that he hadn't to have this attitude because, for example, Melanchthon, he was responsible for a rehabilitation of Jewish people who had already been killed, well, so on a certain diet in 1540. Well, he fought for the Jewish people. But Martin Luther was not different to the other peoples around him. The Catholics wrote similar writings, well, so that was just the time also. And it's not so much an anti-Semitic thinking and a racist thinking, but an anti-Jewish thinking. But it's very hard to differentiate here. So how to deal with such reliefs, which go back to 13th, 14th century? Well, it has nothing to do with Martin Luther at first hand. So often they took them off. But this doesn't change history. You can't take off history and put it into a museum. Here in Wittenberg, they made a counter monument underneath, and I ask you to have a short look onto it. So these bronze plates try to hide, to cover, to make forget what they have done to the Jewish people. But this doesn't work. You can't hide it. You can't make it forget. It comes out again. It comes out in the sign of the cross, and in the frame is indicated Shem Ham Forage died in 6 million of Jews in the sign of the cross. And in Hebrew, from the death I cry to you, me Lord. Although the tree has to do with it. It's a Lebanon cedar. In the Bible, the Lebanon cedar is mentioned 64 times, so it's a symbolical holy tree. It's a gift of young people from Israel as a sign for peace and forgiveness. And both had been planted and inaugurated on the 50th anniversary of the so-called Crystal Night, when they destroyed the synagogues in November 1938. So the inauguration took place in November 1988. That's how they treated the situation of the Jewish peak relief here in Wittenberg. Okay. The chapel, it dates from 14th century. It's a little bit younger than the church itself. First they established the eastern part here of the church, then the chapel, and then they enlarged the church. And we get a new window here. He married a mayor's daughter from Gotha. Her name was Barbara Brengebier. Bring the beer. Nice name, huh? And with her he had 5 children. His eldest son, Hans, was a real gifted one, but he died, unfortunately, during a journey through Italy. So his younger son became his follower, Lucas. Well, the daughters were married to the higher society of Wittenberg. Cranach the Younger married a mayor's daughter, not a mayor, a chancellor's daughter, another Barbara, and she brought this house in the center on the western side with a special gable, also into the property of the Cranach family. If we were not Luther town, Wittenberg, we surely were Cranach city or something like this. Right? So the Cranachs became the wealthiest family in those times here in Wittenberg. Right? Yeah, 19th century, Napoleon let us establish a horse mill here in the church. Well, and then Wittenberg became Prussian territory, and under the rule of the Prussian kings, finally the Emperor William II, church was solemnly inaugurated in 1892. Huh? And so that's the reason why they call this church a Pantheon of Reformation, a place of remembrance, showing roasting a goose, because Hass means in German language goose. He made a play of word with his name in the end of his life, but he continued, in 100 years you'll hear singing a swan, you can't calm down. And that's the reason why, especially in the northern parts of Germany, you find a swan as a symbol for Martin Luther on the steeples of the churches. This has to do with this little story. Then also the other fraction of the Protestants, Zwingli and Calvin, are honored with bronze medallions underneath the organ, a little bit bigger than the other medallions around. So from Prussian time onwards, there was a sort of an administrative union. Well, they didn't celebrate Holy Supper together, but there was an administrative union. Well, for Martin Luther's 500th birthday, they made new paints dedicated to so-called European reformers. So also the English-speaking ones, like Thomas Cranmer, John Knox, are honored with stained glass paints here in this church. Huh? So it's a place of remembrance. At this church, things started at the portal where we go now. Well, the rest here, there's a new building dedicated to house the vicars, the future pastors, who stayed during their training here in this house, because the church is also a training church for the vicars. The tomb of Martin Luther is underneath the pulpit. A long time they weren't sure whether he still was there, because shortly after his death, war times broke out. The emperor arrived here, and he was recommended by Duke Alba to exhume Martin Luther, to burn his bones, and to throw his ashes into the Elbe River to prevent a pilgrimage place here in Wittenberg. The emperor should have answered he wanted only to fight against the living ones and leave in peace the dead ones. Another rumor was that friends had hidden him somewhere else, so they weren't sure whether he still was there. And during renovation works, not reformation, renovation works in 19th century, a worker was looking for the coffin of Martin Luther in the crypt, found it, and brought a handle of that coffin with him as a proof, which is now laid out in the Luther house. Well, so Martin Luther really lies to rest underneath the pulpit here in this church. On the upper rim you see musicians, because music was so important to Martin Luther to spread his ideas. He introduced hymn singing in the services. Well, and in the center of the beam you see the Prussian eagle, because it dates from Prussian time. And in the tympanon above, Martin Luther on the left, presenting the Augsburgian Confession, and opposite to him Philip Melanchthon presenting Martin Luther presenting the Bible, the translated Bible, and opposite to him Philip Melanchthon presenting the Augsburgian Confession, the creed which is still valid today, the program which is still valid today. And in the backdrop, the old skyline of Wittenberg, still with pointed steeple. This was a certain William Tyndale who spent some time together with Martin Luther and Melanchthon here in Wittenberg, so he strongly was influenced by our reformers. Well, and then with the Pilgrim Fathers, the new thinking went to America and then to the whole world.
when this whole world starts getting me down, and people are just too much for me to face. I'm on the climb way up to the top of the stairs, and all my cares they've been right in space. Oh, on the roof, it's peaceful as can be, and there the world below, it don't bother me. No, 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 no. So when I come home feeling tired and weak, I got to go up where the air is fresh and sweet for you now. I'll get far away from the hustle and crowd and all bad rat race stories down in the street. Oh, on the roof, that's the only place that I know. Look at the city, baby, where you just have to